Hello everyone, welcome to Center for Spatial Justice. We are a non-profit organization working for more democratic, more just, more ecological, more livable urban and rural spaces in Istanbul and beyond. We call ourselves as MAD. That's abbreviation of the Turkish title of our organization, MADacademy. And MADacademy is our flagship program in which we organize walks, seminars, participatory map-making activities, as well as discussions like this. This is the 5th of MADacademy. This is a program we started a month and a half ago, so we are excited about that. Today's title is Rethinking Urban Informality in the Global South and Beyond. This is our first English gathering meeting, thanks to Hesam. Hesam Kamalipour is a lecturer in urban design and planning at the School of Geography and Planning at the University of Cardiff. His research and teaching focus on the challenge of understanding the dynamics of informal urbanism and the ways in which different forms of informality work in the global context. Current research interests include informal urbanism, forms of urban informality, adaptation, typology, urban morphology, tactical and temporary urbanism, public space and street life, place identity and urban mapping. Hesam has been running a research for a while. Before moving to Cardiff University, he was in the University of Melbourne, right? And what is very exciting about his research is that it's a multi-city research on urban informality. That is how we met, actually. He's also interested in bringing in the experience of Istanbul's informality, urban informality, into his research. That's how we met. And luckily, we started already somehow collaborating. Just 3 days ago, Hesam's international planning
and development,
in development class, they were with us. We went to Fikirtepe together. First, we went and walked through the Bağdat Avenue and observed the urban transformation taking place there. And then from Bağdat Caddesi, we walked to Fikirtepe and observed the urban renewal project over there and had the opportunity to compare both. Thanks to their classroom and the fact that he found us, actually, and that's how we met. And we also decided, hey, why not? Maybe we should also do a discussion on urban informality, in which our founding member and director, Yaşar Adnan Adanalı, could also respond to your presentation and your research. Yaşar is the director, as I said, of Center for Spatial Justice. He has been also finishing up his work at the University of TU Berlin, and he also has been teaching for some while now on participatory planning at the University of TU Darmstadt. So we will be listening to Hesam's presentation. Maybe it will take 30-45 minutes or so. There's no really strict time limit on that. And then Yaşar will be responding to his presentation and work, and then we'll open the floor for discussions and questions from you. Thanks for coming. Thanks a lot for being here, Hesam. I think the floor is yours.
Okay. So, hi everyone. Thank you, Sinan, and also Yaşar, for arranging the whole thing and the work that you've done so far, and also for having us here. It's my pleasure to be here in the magnificent and beautiful city of Istanbul, and here at the Center for Spatial Justice as well, which is doing a great job in terms of also introducing an alternative way of academy, which I'm particularly interested in. So I'm gonna start my presentation. This is basically related to the research that I've done throughout the last 5 to 6 years, mostly at the University of Melbourne, partly at Monash University, and to some extent at the University of Cardiff that I'm now based in the UK. And we've been doing most of the work. I would like to acknowledge Professor Kim Dovey based at the University of Melbourne, and also Dr. Nasran Peymani, who is also now a lecturer at the Welsh School of Architecture, with whom we've done parts of these works that I'm going to present today. Yeah, let's get started. Perhaps all of us know about that photo. This is a photo I took in the city of Chandigarh, and the city that has become basically a city after the intervention and layout and the things that architects and the built environment professions went to do. So this is a famous monument which is located in the Capitol complex toward the end of the city, and this is the photo that we often see in most of the architectural books about architectural interventions and the role of the built environment professions when it comes to cities. But what we don't often see is that one. This is the same city from up in the air. I'm not sure how visible that might be. These are the layout of the original design of the layout, and the part that is interesting for me is the part to the west of the area. That juxtaposition and intersections between what is planned and how it fails to accommodate what is not planned, or the unplanned developments, informal developments. And again, what we don't often see in many of these publications in architecture are these two images, which are from the same city. This is the image I took in my visit there. Parts of the city that have already become informal to extents that you don't hardly find the traces of the interventions. And also the part that is fascinating for me is that area to this side of the city, while the formal city sets the ground with outlining whatever is considered to be the order and the hand of the architect, the role of the built environment professions. What is quite interesting is how informality takes over and trying to expose the limits of our profession when it comes to thinking about cities and how they should or they can work. This is the Capitol complex, the monument. That photo is taken from there, and right next to that, this is a huge development that has taken place informally. When we are talking about informality, it's basically about those activities, if you want to broadly define it, is about the activities that take place outside of the state control. So there are several distinctions that we need to make. One, that informality is not necessarily about legality or illegality. So the relations between formal and informal is not necessarily the relation between legal and illegal. There are activities that are informal and just beyond the legal framework. So they are not necessarily illegal, but they are informal in a sense that they take place outside of the state control. Most of the street life activities are in a sense informal. That self-organized movement of pedestrians are in itself informal as it takes place outside of the state control, but not necessarily illegal in any way. So that distinction is critical, and it's critical not to confuse the relations between formal and informal as if it is a relation between legal and illegal, which is a different point of view when it comes to informality. The other key aspect that we need to consider is that informality is not necessarily limited to the cities of the global south. Informality takes place in public space, in everyday activities across the board, across the cities. So I tend to not use that distinction of the global north and south, and I want to make that point that we need to remember that urban informality is not necessarily about the cities of the global south. The photo down there is actually from the city of Melbourne. That photo is from Bangkok, and this is parts of the Cape Town. What is interesting here is that when we are talking about urban informality, it's often inevitable to address it in the absence of its relation to urban formality. So urban informality is in intricate relationship with urban formality. As you can see here, this is a neighborhood that has become informalized in the city of Cape Town. We can already see how informality takes over after a neighborhood has been formally developed. And this is here, the ways in which the informal market, as the roots of urban informality, goes back to the informal sector, and the ways in which those DIY activities take place. You can see the relationships between formal markets and informal markets in one frame, as one often relies and negotiates with the other to survive in public space, and also to sustain livelihoods in the long term. So what is critical here is to think about the necessity of relying on urban informality as it is in a nuanced relationship with urban formality. So we cannot isolate issues around urban informality and try to address them in the absence of thinking about their relationship to urban formality. And what is happening here is that in many parts of, you can see that sign here. So informality can be a transgressive activity, transgressing the formal codes of the city, in this case the skateboarders. And that's why in many cases urban informality is resisted, particularly by the state, because of that transgressive nature of urban informality that tends to meet the basic needs, and it's a form of civic disobedience, as members argue, to meet basic needs. And there's also a distinction I would like to make that in many cases when we are talking about urban informality, it's not necessarily about claiming specific rights to use or appropriate parts of public space, in a sense that Lefebvre and Harvey talked about that. In many cases, urban informality is an asset to manage the conditions of power, it is, we argued. But what is critical to remember is that urban informality is not in many cases a choice, a conscious decision to claim your rights to use and appropriate and transform public spaces. But it's often related to necessity rather than choice. It's a form of, as I mentioned, civic disobedience to meet basic needs in public spaces. So the question here is that what have we learned so far throughout the last 5 decades about the ways in which we approach urban informality, and in this particular case here, the story that unfortunately is still happening about demolition, which is related to ignorance and denial of urban informality, and in this case, a form of urban informality that is already settled, which we know it often as informal settlements. And there's also a distinction between when we call informal settlements with squatter and slum. Slum is often a condition, and UN has a specific definition for slums. One of them is overcrowding, the internal overcrowding, meaning that more than 2 people sharing one room. So in many cases, when we are talking about informal settlements, we are not necessarily talking about slums. Informal settlements may or may not become slums. And the vice versa, informal settlements or slums may become unslum if those conditions are going to be finished. And there's also another distinction. Informal settlements are not necessarily squatter settlements, because the term squatter is related to the tenure condition. So it's about the legality of the tenure condition, whereas informality, when it comes to informal settlements, is about the self-organized production activities here settling outside of the state control. The practice of demolition, which unfortunately is still happening, used to be there in many cities since 5 decades ago, and this is the case in Johannesburg. An informal settlement is there and it has been demolished after a year. So this is still, unfortunately, a common pattern in mainstream thinking when it comes to intervention in regards to informal settlements. Demolition. But what demolition does, it just deals with the symptoms. Those people are there because of a reason, and that reason is access to jobs and opportunities offered by cities. Cities are engines of economies. They're offering jobs and opportunities. People will not go anywhere even though you try to demolish the settlements. And this is a story of Johannesburg, but it's not necessarily limited to Johannesburg. Throughout the last 5 decades, this is what happens. So a few years later, the same area has become encroached again. And this is now. So what was the aim of doing that? So in a sense, the reproduction of informality and a base of resources throughout the process of demolition, which are in many cases accompanied with forced evictions and violence, unfortunately. But have we learned anything from that process? The story of Johannesburg, which is not necessarily limited to Johannesburg, which is the story of many cities. Demolitions are often lead to displacement, and in many cases going back to the previous condition. I'm not going to go through the details of why that urban morphology is different from the initial one, because there is another line of thinking which is about the informal process of learning as you do. So it's doing by learning as well, which is happening informally, that changes that one to this one. Another side of that story, the process and the practice of the built environment professions when it comes to informal settlements, is often about replacing with these types of houses. And again, this is a case in Bangkok, in Thailand, but it's not necessarily limited to Bangkok. This is a global story that's still unfortunately happening, even in 2019. So the practice of demolishing an informal settlement and replacing that morphology with this type of housing, which is often in many cases a mid-rise apartment units, that the previous residents are now becoming in many cases the new renters. From owner you become a renter. But what is interesting here is that what we can learn from those previous experiences. This mid-rise house has already been in the process of informalization. So a formal intervention comes to play, but it becomes informalized over time, and traces start from here. So this is a kind of episodic series. The second episode here is that one, producing that condition on the ground level, which is the most productive part of informal settlements, because often the intersections between public and private territories produce a threshold between inside and outside, and that threshold is the point of activity, production, flows of money, people, and activities in informal settlements. That condition is going to be radically changed to everything that is happening above the ground level, and the ground level has been allocated to a parking area for the people who may or may not, and in many cases they cannot afford to have a car. So the problem here is that when you're coming with a formal mindset, you're going to develop such a thing because you don't know how informality works. And in many cases, I'm going to summarize all of these interventions in one sentence. Poor understanding of how urban informality works is a recipe for poor interventions. And that's why I and my colleagues also, with whom I've done parts of these works, have started to focus on how urban informality works and different forms of urban informality. The second part of this story is that one. So that ground floor has already been appropriated by the residents there. So those columns that have been produced through formal processes are now accommodating an ad hoc shop, a pop-up shop produced by the people, so reproducing the retail activities that used to take place before that condition. And what is interesting here is that the relations between formal and informal is often the relations between strategies of the state and tactics of the citizens. And those intersections become productive in that sense, that you see the intersections between tactics of citizens and strategies of the state at the same time in one frame. It is about the relations between a form of striation and looseness of space, an attempt to making place loose, to make advantage of that looseness of place. And also it's about the relations between striation and smoothness form of production of space in this case. Another side of this story, as you can see here, those edges of the public space has already been transformed, but now informally. So there is a new part of a retail strip has already been formed by the residents. Again, to remember how it used to work, even though the intervention was already in place. So what is interesting here is that for us to again rethink, because that raises many questions about the built environment professions and their role when it comes to urban informality. Is it our role to fix on final form? Is fixation on the final form, is product-based thinking, outcome-based thinking a part of our disciplines? Whether we are architects, urban designers, planners, landscape architects, all that can be defined under the umbrella of built environment professions. What is the role of the built environment professions? Is it a time for changing from outcome thinking to procedural thinking about processes, architecting the process, rather than producing the final form and fixing on the final form? A common critique that we often get used to hear from architects, and perhaps in many cases star architects, that the project hasn't been delivered as I have designed it. So that criticism that the outcome is in many cases more important than what architecture or urban design and all of the built environment professions are meant to do. Is it our role to produce and fix that final form? Or is it our role to allow for informality to take over in this case? And how far can we go in order to understand the process of informality and self-organization? And the whole pilot area at ground level has already been appropriated to accommodate a range of activities, basically loosening up the space at the ground level. So that's another side of the story. In many practice of interventions, even when you don't demolish and you don't replace, you rely on the existing morphology and just try to upgrade houses on the same site, which is called in situ upgrading, in incremental in situ upgrading, such as the case here in Pune in India. But it's interesting again here, which raises again the question about our role as a built environment professions. An avant-garde upgrading project has been taking place here in the city of Pune, and the project has already finished when I visited. And the process of incremental adaptations, informal adaptations, started to emerge. So is it upgrading, or is it our role to finish the process of incremental transformation? To what extent are we going to be capable of putting a full stop after the process of upgrading and transformations? Is it possible to limit the productive capacities of informality? Because a part of the process was also to negotiate for contributions from residents to contribute parts of their frontages to the public space. Because in many cases in informal settlements, nobody takes care of the public space in terms of the extent, quality, and the rights to prevent what we know the tragedy of commons to take place in informal settlements. But then after upgrading, the process of encroachment onto the public space has already started. So again, what's the role of the built environment professions when it comes to upgrading, and to what extent are we capable of putting an end point to the process of informal change? I'm going to sum up that theoretical discussion about the relations between formal and informal in that photo that I took. This is the city of Caracas in Venezuela. And what is interesting here about the relations between formal and informal is that that relation is not a form of dichotomy, is not a binary distinction between what is formal and what is informal. In many cases, we are dealing with a twofold condition where one becomes another and vice versa. While the formal city becomes informalized, the informal city is already in the process of formalization, and there are in-between conditions. So making those binary distinctions is going to lead, again, to binary thinking and legitimizing one against another, whether formality, and in many cases, is formality. One of the key forms of urban informality, because when we are talking about urban informality, we need to remember that urban informality in itself is a form of multiplicity. We are not talking about a single entity. It's already talking about forms of urban informality. And one of those forms is informal transport and practice of informal transport as a key form of urban informality. This is the city of Bangkok. And this is a photo of the same city. We've used urban mapping as a way of producing spatial knowledge and its capacity to unravel the unseen realities of the city. And here, this tells the story. Those green lines are the main public transport corridors in the city, and those circle areas are the catchment areas around each of those stations. So basically, this network shows the formal network of public transport. Why that matters? Because public transport is a way of offering access to jobs and opportunities in cities, and in this case, these two areas mostly. So having access then to public transport, to formal modes of public transport, is a way of having access to jobs and opportunities of the cities. And for many of the urban poor, for the rural to urban migrants, that's the very first reason they came to cities. That process of rural to urban migration, because of having access to jobs and opportunities. But what is interesting here is that formal modes of transport, in many cases, don't reach those red patches on this map. And those red patches show the areas with the concentration of urban informality, mostly the urban poor as well. Although it's critical not to conflate informality with poverty. But this is also a conflation of these two. But what it means here is that most of these pockets that are the more vulnerable parts of the society, and the ones who are likely to be more disadvantaged, are systematically excluded from having access to jobs and opportunities. The first thing is the spatial access. And the next layer of that discussion is affordability of access. Because you may have spatial access to formal modes of public transport, such as these small patches here and there. But then the next layer of questions is about the question of affordability. To what extent having access to formal modes of transport is affordable for urban poor? So what is important here, again, when we are talking about urban informality, we need to consider the whole frame about the relations between formal and informal. And in this case, the competitions between formal and informal modes of transport in cities, and why it is not an easy decision to wish urban informality, and in this case, informal modes of transport away. They remain competitive because they have the capacity to meet the requirements of the market. This is the city of Tehran, and that white point there is one of the main stations in the city. And this map, again, using urban mapping as a way of producing and unraveling those competitions between formal and informal modes of transport. That white point is the start point, and this map is called Isochrone Mapping. Basically, to put it in a simple word, this answers the question of how far you can go if you've got 20 minutes using different modes of transport. And that's, in many cases, the logic of our decision making when it comes to selection between modes of transport in terms of access. So in this case, 20 minutes, if you've got 20 minutes, how far you can go using different modes of transport. By walking, this is the extent to which you can have access to the opportunities that city offers, relying on your feet. And that blue shows a mix of BRT and metro system, which are the two main forms of formal transport. This is how far you can go in the same time frame of 20 minutes, starting from that white point. And the red one, surprisingly, and answers why it's not also an easy decision to wish car dependency away. In many cases, because of that map shows the story that it's often a difficult decision to argue for and wishing for our cities not to be car dependent anymore. The red shows the catchment area if you have a private car or get a car taxi. This is how far you can go within the same time frame of 20 minutes. But what is interesting here is that yellow one. This is the catchment area if you rely on informal modes of transport, in this case, motorcycle taxis. This map shows how competitive they are when the formal city is clogged in traffic and all formal modes of transport can only go so far. And even the private car ownership and taxis cannot compete with informal modes of transport within the same time frame. They offering more, and that's why in many cases they become competitive and remain competitive in the market. And it's not often an easy decision just to wish them away, because they work in many cases even better than formal modes of transport. So this is again the story of one city, but it's not necessarily the story of that specific city. Another key form of informality is informal trading, informal street trading, which is often in many cases known as informal vending. We are dealing again with different forms of street vending. That in itself is again a form of multiplicity. We are dealing with different types of informal street trading. This is a piece of public space, an intersection, and these dots show different types of informal street trading taking place in that public space. One of the greatest capacities of informal street trading is again related to our role as ability moral professions. They have a specific temporal capacity to cover the flaws of urban developments and physical interventions, such as the case here. This is the city of Quito. I took that photo. The capacity of informal trading to recover the production of impermeable and blank interfaces, the points of connection between inside and outside, where in many cases, mostly the neoliberal urban developments, one of the key characteristics at the ground level is the production of impermeable blank interfaces. And what it does, it offers the capacity to cover the flaws of design intervention, the flaws and the limits of our intervention when it comes to urban developments. But again, what is interesting is that if we compare it, this is the same public space, and this map shows the gender mix in that public space. And if you flip back and forth, there is a relationship between the places that informal street traders appropriate public space and the concentration of gender mix along those parts of public space. And if you go further, there is also a specific relationship between the edges of the formal market with places that informal street traders appropriate public space. Those edges often provide the opportunity for negotiating to have access to electricity, water, and the other conditions, and also negotiating space and visibility in public space. Informal street traders often attracted to pedestrian flows, but that process is a part of an escalation process. They need to make benefit out of leaving the access network open to flows of pedestrians. Otherwise, they cannot sustain a livelihood. The sustainability of their livelihood relies on making public space open to pedestrian flows. And that circulation, concentration of informal street trading may reach the point that they're clogging the access network. And that's the point that displacement takes place. Informal street traders have the capacity, because of temporality and also mobility, to negotiate the space and also visibility that they benefit from in relation to flows of pedestrians, which make them adaptive in relation to everyday life activities. when we are thinking about permanent interventions, we are losing, in many cases, that adaptive capacity. One of the other key forms of urban informality is the informality that is already settled, informal settlements. These are three cities: the city of Bangkok, the city of Medellin in Colombia, and this is the city of Pune in India. What is important here is that, again, informal settlements, when we are talking about informal settlement, we are not talking about one type of informality. Informal settlements in itself are forms of multiplicity. We are dealing with different types of informal settlements. And these different types also occupy different patterns and produce different patterns of urban informality, such as these three cases here. We are dealing here in the city of Medellin, those patches that are pushed to the outskirts of the city along the urban fringes and along the hilltops, and also the escarpments of the city. Whereas in the city of Pune, we are dealing with an interstitial, filling the vacuums of urban developments, bits of pieces, patches all over the city, but in smaller size. And in the city of Pune, we are dealing with a mix of large and small grain sizes of informal settlements, and also different types. But if you look closely, there are similarities in many ways. One of the key similarities is related to access to formal modes of transport. Again, most of these patches, as you can see, have been excluded from opportunities that city offers, access to jobs, and that's why in many cases there is an intricate relationship between informal pockets of settlements and informal modes of transport, as those informal modes of transport have the capacity to fill the gaps of formal transport in cities. And also, if you look closely, we are dealing with different patterns at the very micro scale. The map to the left shows the distribution of functional mix in these settlements. And as you can see, these yellow areas are the mix of visit and live. And in many cases, informal settlements are concentration of not necessarily houses. We are dealing with the production, inside production, and also place of visit and place of work at the same time. What is interesting here is that in different processes, as you can see, those yellow patches follow a specific pattern of emerging along those more integrated pieces of access network, the areas that attract more pedestrian flows. And this is in many cases a self-organized production of functional mix. So the key question here is that whether going with master planning and land zone development from top down would be a good decision when informality has the capacity to adapt through a self-organized process of change to pedestrian flows in terms of producing functional mixes in specific areas. Why there and not inside? Why along these edges and not here? So again, what can we learn about the generative process of development, and also different building densities? So we are not necessarily dealing with 1 to 2 stories, such as the case in Plum Toi in Bangkok. We are dealing with up to 4 to 5 stories in the other cases, and mix of grain sizes as well. And if we look more closely, scale of 10 meters, we are dealing with specific relations between inside and outside. These maps show the mix of conditions about the connectivity between inside and outside in informal settlements. A key condition that we are dealing with, and the number of entrances, and the concentration of entrances. This is 100 meters of a transect in all of these settlements. And we are dealing with a considerable amount of concentration of entrances and a street life intensity in these settlements, and mix of public-private interfaces. The condition that we often miss in many neoliberal urban developments, the production of blank edges and also large grain developments that limits the capacity of connectivity between inside and outside, and producing mix of public-private interfaces. In order to understand those conditions, I've been thinking about the criteria for different types of these settlements and the ways in which inside is connected to outside. One of the key criteria here is connectivity. It's about the extent to which inside is connected to outside, from blank interfaces to highly connected ones. And the other side, we are dealing with the proximity condition, which is about the extent to which those public-private interfaces are located adjacent to the public space. So we are dealing with setback conditions here and adjacent connectivity to the edges of the public space. And if we transform that one and translate it to mapping, that produces, and that's gonna show us how these edges work in informal settlements. And this is what we're gonna miss if we go with the interventions of replacing that kind of morphology with any other kind of morphology, whether it's mid-rise apartment and so on. What is quite important about informal settlements, it's about mapping of informal settlements in different cities. This is the city of Mumbai in India, and these are 3 different maps of the same city dealing with more or less the same reality of mapping informal settlements. And as you can see here, these 3 maps are different. But that's not the only issue that we are dealing here with. The main issue is that the mainstream approach to mapping informal settlements is adopting a binary distinction between what is formal and what is informal. So we are dealing with the 2 condition in many cities, those red patches, or here, these gray patches. So we are dealing with the condition that we call it informal and the condition that is called formal city. But how about these ones? And what that binary distinction does, it provides a fuel to that kind of thinking that legitimizes formality against informality. When we are approaching informal settlements with a binary distinction between formal and informal, it systematically legitimizes one against another. And in these cases, this is Caracas, mid-rise apartment housing provided in the city area, and you can see that signature of Hugo Chavez at that time, which is about 6-story high. Why that signature is there, and what does it signify? It's a signifier of legitimacy. What is considered to be legitimate, legitimizing formality against informality, dismissing one, and approving and authorizing the other, and endorsing the other. And in this case, in Bangkok, a settlement that has been upgraded, putting figures as a signifier of showing what happened, and now this area is acknowledged. Now it's endorsed. Legitimizing what has become formalized is a way of ignoring the other, is a way of dismissing the other. So going with that binary distinction is going to fuel that kind of thinking as well. But what is quite interesting in that one is that guy over there that has already started to take over, although settlement has been already formalized. So the process of informal transformation is already in play. If we look closely, this is the city of Rio, and these are the pockets of urban informality. If you look closely, each of these photos show those pockets and how they look like at the ground level street view. We've noticed that although we are dealing with the same kind of mapping, a binary distinction between the formal city and informal settlements, we are dealing with a range of different conditions, but mapped all as same, labeled as informal settlements to produce that kind of binary thinking. The common understanding of what we call it informal settlements, these are photos from different cities in Southeast Asia, South Asia, Middle East, Africa, and South America. And these are the same frames of 200 meters to 200 meters. This is the condition that we are more or less more familiar with. But how about these conditions? Are these formal? Are these informal? And in many cases, these are the conditions that remain on map. But those are the more critical parts. In order to understand those dynamics, we came up with basically by looking across 15 cities in Southeast Asia, South Asia, Middle East, Africa, and South America, to see what the variations are and what are the conditions that we are dealing with, regardless of the socioeconomic, sociocultural differences across the world. So what we are dealing here, it's a matrix of 9 possible conditions. And on one axis, we're dealing with urban design, which is basically about the production of access networks. And our architecture, which is basically about the production of buildings. That ranges from formal to informal, and same here, ranges from formal and informal. Meaning that the planned access networks and self-organized access network, and here self-organized production of buildings, to planned buildings. These are the common conditions that we are dealing with, that we call it II here and FF there, which is called formal city and the common understanding of informal settlements, if we see it from up in the air. This is the self-production, a self-organized production of access networks, and at the same time self-organized production of buildings. And the things that we are dealing here in the formal condition is the planned and surveyed access network, and on that side, the formal production of buildings as well. But at least we are dealing with 7 in-between conditions that in many cases they remain unmapped on cities, and when they remain unmapped, they facilitate the process of ignorance and denial when it comes to the strategies of the state. These mixed conditions, one of them we are dealing with a mix of formal and informal buildings. The settlements that have parts of the settlements that have been upgraded, where formal buildings have been inserted in an informal settlement. So we are dealing with a mixed condition there, but the access network remains informal, self-organized. The next condition is where the access network starts to look like as if it is formal. That's why we call it quasi-formal access network. And we call it quasi because it appears to be formal, to be planned, but it's not actually planned. And there is a reason why we are dealing with that specific time in different cities. And that reason is related in many cases, such as that one, where we are dealing with informal production of buildings, the self-organized production of buildings, but a quasi-formal access network when we are dealing with pirate developments, where a pirate developer have that in mind, that similarity or imitating the ways in which access networks of the formal cities are, or the adjacent areas are, is going to facilitate the future formalization in a sense. So it's a reverse logic, but from beginning, that you have in mind a kind of informal anticipatory planning that resemblance to the formal city is going to facilitate, is going to put you on the list, on top of the list, when it comes to state interventions and formalizations. You're facilitating that process of formalization, but it's economically driven. That's why in many cases the semi-organized invasions and pirate developments produce that kind of morphology. The other condition that we are dealing with, which is in many cases the site and services, where the access network and the key infrastructures are already in place, planned, but the architecture is entirely informal. Many of the site and services projects produce that kind of morphology. The other type that we are dealing with, where formal neighborhood has become informalized. So there is a primacy in time and a precedence that we are dealing with. So formality comes first and informality takes over, and we are dealing with the mixed condition. Another condition here, which is the central areas in most medieval cities, where the formalized settlements, that the architecture has become formalized, but the access network is a mix of formal and informal. And the other condition, which is not really urban, and is mostly about those mobile houses that are located on a plateau, that there is no specific planned access network. So we are dealing with informal access network, but the architecture of those mobile houses are units that have been planned and are mobile enough to be located around the area. So in a sense, we are dealing with an informal condition, the condition that we call it informal mix, that is an informal, whether in terms of the mix of architecture, production of building, or mix of quasi-access network. And the condition that we call it formal mix, where either the access network or the production of buildings are formal, and the condition that is formal. What is often mapped in many cases is that one and in that one. So we are dealing at least with 7 other conditions that by and large have remained unmapped across the board, across the cities. So in order to understand those dynamics, we went for looking at 15 cities in Southeast Asia, South Asia, parts of Middle East, Africa, and South America, to use that typology as a mapping, as a tool to unravel those conditions. This is the city of Cairo, and those yellow patches are the only patches where architecture, the production of building, and the production of access network are both self-organized. The thing that we typically categorize as informal settlements. But what is quite fascinating in that city is that most of the other pockets are of mixed conditions that in many cases remain unmapped. Those are the in-between conditions where the access networks produce a quasi-formal condition. This is the city of Caracas, the contrasting condition where we are dealing with mostly patches of self-organized building and self-organized access networks pushed to the 2 edges of the cities, to the east and to the west. This is the city of Karachi in Pakistan, and again we are dealing, most of the patches are of those mixed conditions and not necessarily the informal conditions, again pushed to the edges of the cities. This is the city of Mumbai, and again we are dealing with mixed condition, but most of the patches are of those informal conditions where buildings and access networks are both self-organized, but again we are dealing with some mixed conditions as well. This is the city of Cape Town. By contrast, most of the patches here are of those dark brown ones, which are the formal mix. And in many cases, there are formal neighborhoods that have become informalized. This is Manila in Philippines, and we are dealing again with mixed conditions where the architecture is a mix of formal and informal, the production of houses, and small patches of self-organized building and access networks. This is the city of Lima in Peru. Most of the pockets of urban informality are pushed to the outskirts of the city. This is the area of the famous Villa El Salvador in that part of the city that produces that kind of morphology where the access network is formally planned, but the architecture has remained informally, the production of that site and services projects. This is Jakarta in Indonesia. We are dealing with mixed conditions of the architecture, ranging from mix of formal and informal buildings, and also access network that start to look like a formal city in some cases. This is Nairobi, where the mixed conditions are pushed to the east and west side of the city, and this is a famous area of Kibera, which is the self-organized production of buildings and access networks. This is Rio in Brazil. And what is interesting about Rio is that most of the settlements are located along escarpments on hilly areas with steep topography. But what is interesting is that the morphologies change from self-organized buildings and access networks to mixed condition as those patches become closer to the formal city. So that transition happens. This is Buenos Aires in Argentina, and we are dealing with mostly that condition of formal mix, where the access network is formally laid out, but the architecture is informal or mixed conditions. This is Johannesburg, and we ended up changing the frame of analysis from 30 to 30 kilometers to more to cover the conditions because of the story of apartheid and economic and socio-spatial divisions, that all of the informalities are pushed to the edges of the city. The informal mix and formal mix condition, most of the patches are of these formal mix, where the access network is formally produced, but architecture, informal architecture has taken over. So why that matters, the thing that is important here is that most practices of upgrading and transformation of these settlements tend to change one of these types to another one, such as incremental upgrading that changes that morphology, which is self-organized production of buildings and access networks, to a mix of a quasi-formal access network where architecture has become formalized. Replacement, which is again a common practice, and that explains why binary thinking systematically fuels that kind of intervention, because the only way that you can imagine when you are dealing with two conditions is that arrow. The only possible solution then would be changing from that to that, and that's why you're going with replacement, because you don't know and you never think about the other in-between conditions. The other type of intervention, which is called core plus or shell plus, where a formal core or a formal framework in terms of the structure is going to be provided, such as the case in Torre David in Caracas that has been evacuated, and letting informality to take over, to work as an infill within a formal structure, is going to produce that kind of morphology that you have formality and then informality takes over. And the other interventions, such as site and services and reblocking, changes that time to that time. And the key focus is going to be on access network rather than housing. So you are just investing on the access network and infrastructure and letting informality to take care of housing. So housing becomes a ward, informal housing becomes an asset. Informal settlements are also in the process of change, and that's one of the key characteristics of these areas. This is Buenos Aires, an area located in parts of the city. You can see the city has surrounded that green open area here. This is 2008. This is 2010. The area has started to be encroached on. This is 2012, and this is 2015. If I haven't shown you these three, how would you understand that this part here is informal? It has already formed and become connected to parts of the adjacent areas of the formal city that are those parts here. So in order to understand that process of change, again, we use mapping to unravel those increments of change. What is again interesting here is that the common understanding about increments of change in informal settlement is that it's often about the process of adding and adding and adding and adding. So everything is going to be extended. You're adding step by step as the investment and flows of money and capacities are going to be available. But what it shows is that informality has a unique capacity to learn from its own practice, and all through self-organized processes. Those orange color ones show the areas that have been added in every increment. So these orange ones are parts of the access network that have been added in this increment. And these have become the existing condition, and new parts have been added, those new orange ones, in this increment. But what is interesting are these ones, the parts in dark red. Those are parts of the access network that have been added before, but removed in the next increment. That rationale is related to the ways in which the final production of access network tends to connect and communicate with the adjacent parts of the formal city. In a sense, whatever that has become or contributing to making the access network less integrated has been removed in the next step. So increments of change and incremental transformations in informality is not often about adding. It's also about removing and recovering and learning by doing, which is a capacity that we often lose when we are going with permanent interventions through top-down processes. In order to identify increments of change based on the database that we had across those cities, we have narrowed down to these typical increments of change in these settlements, which is the adding of one room at a time, whether vertically or horizontally, replacing materials, which is a way of repairing your existing condition. So you're not adding, it's space neutral, you're not adding and encroaching more and claiming more private space, you're just repairing and changing the existing condition. Another increment of change, which is quite fascinating and is happening in many cities, regardless of socioeconomic and sociocultural and sociopolitical conditions, is that increment, which we call it divide. It is about using and relying on your existing condition and trying to produce functional mix without adding and claiming more private space. So opening up a shop in your existing building is one of the typical increments of change, and that one where you have an available space but you just divide it internally to provide more income. It's going to be a new renting opportunity. So you're again investing and relying on your existing asset, which is that property, to acquire more income by renting, but that practice of division, which is again not adding more space, but using the existing space and dividing it into 2 units. The other one is the practice of connecting to major infrastructure and also networks, broader networks. Another increment of change is about extending. When you're adding a veranda, a roof terrace, or a balcony, in many cases, this is the first step to that increment. And why that's the case? Because these are in a way, half-room extensions that allow and offer the opportunity to test the resistance toward future additions. So you're testing here in order to get there. And that testing is going to happen at a very micro scale because your immediate neighbors may also ask what you're doing if you're adding more. Because that's going to be contagious. If someone adding a level, the others may do. And that's, again, another thing that we call it informal rule, that those adjacency works as a kind of informal rule. And that's one of the key rules that defines the height limits in many informal settlements. And another one, which is the infill, where there is a formal structure in place and informality works as an infill. You rely on an informal structure, and this is the case where most formal buildings in some of the cities have become invaded. There is a formal structure already in place, but informality comes and take over, relying on that formal structure. One thing here, I put a distinction between permanent and temporary in the first stage after accessing to land. You may decide to go with temporary condition or permanent condition, and why that's the case, because in the formal city, this is the condition. We don't have that condition in the process of formal production of buildings and developments. So why that condition is a choice in many cities across the world, and that's why. This is Cape Town. This is how the area looked like, and this is happening in 2 days. What kind of formal production of building and formal development can be so time efficient in order to provide shelter to such huge number? To be market responsive in a sense. And that's the power of temporality and starting from temporality. But this is not the only rationale. The key part is related to the ways in which starting with temporary structure allows you to test the resistance of the adjacent ones, the adjacent neighbors, and also resistance from the state. And that's a part of the reason that in many cases, the initial process of invasions need to take place fast enough and usually overnight, because there is another condition of invisibility and making use of invisibility in play in the early stages. You need to be fast and as invisible as possible in order to establish that condition, and in semi-organized invasions, that's the key. So again, temporality offers range of capacities, because you are not risking too much again. Whereas if you go with permanence from the beginning, you are risking the whole investment, which is the only thing that you have in many cases. And if that's going to be demolished a week or so from that, you're losing everything. Whereas in that one, you're not risking too much. You're testing the resistance as well. That could be an initial stage to that one, but may stay the same for a while. So I'm going to finish off with the discussion around visibility, and I think particularly that matters. This is the city of Medellin, and this is the map. I think some of you may already be familiar with the process. You know how Street View in Google works, Google Maps. There's that icon to the right side of the page that if you hold clicking on that and dragging that one, this blue network start to emerge on the cities that are covered by Google Street View. But what is interesting for me are those areas there. This is the city of Buenos Aires, but the story is not the story of Buenos Aires. It's the story of the cities mostly across the global south. The Google Street View, which is in a sense the most affordable way of visibility for the ones who cannot afford to go to many cities across the world. This is the only way that you can have access to something at your desk. This is not the entire story, but this is a part of the story that touches upon a major issue. Why and what's the process and how that Google driver decides to stop here and not there, here and not there, not going there, not going there, not going there. In order to understand those questions, I started to do that one. This is the city of Medellin, and those yellow areas show the areas that have remained uncovered by Google Street View. As you can see here, it's a huge part of the city that I would say, well, intentionally or unintentionally, trying to be neutral, have remained invisible from the global gaze. But why that's the case? The next question for me was that what those areas are, in a sense, that make it a specific condition to produce that kind of invisibility. And if you look closely, this is related to the power of mapping and the politics of mapping, because it's related to the knowledge and power and who controls it and why. Informal settlements in many cases have remained off the map of the formal city. They've remained unmapped, and they are often blank spaces on official maps. In many cases, we deal with the condition that there is a tendency to ignore them. Nothing exists. They're often rendered as blank spaces on official maps. What is it there in mapping that makes it so powerful and intentionally used in order to make these areas invisible? Which again fuels the practices towards denial and acknowledging these settlements as myth, or in many cases temporal. That's why not intervening would be a way to go for. If you look closely, these areas are often of four types. There are either informal settlements or gated communities. There are also two other conditions: industrial developments and military zones. I'm not particularly arguing for those two. But for these two, there is a particularly interesting story that the narratives of both the urban poor and the urban rich, without any communication, are producing the same condition. Both of them are contributing to making our cities more and more invisible. And that's a process that I call it formal and informal practice of globalization. It's a new form of globalizing regimes of invisibility. One intentionally and the other one having no role in that, left out from that production of visibility. So in order to understand those conditions, we also identified 4 types of visibility. And the key question here was that who sees what from where in cities? So what we see is going to be important as we're going to see the stories afterwards. And in many cases, we've noticed the issue of visibility is particularly more important than many other issues at stake. So in many settlements, most of the cases, they've remained invisible from the gaze of the formal city. And the gaze of the formal city includes the middle class who are passing by, and also the gaze of the state, those who are involved in the process of decision-making and addressing informal settlements. There's also another condition where the whole informal settlements is only visible by means of its facade. So that public facade is going to be the only visible part of an informal settlement. The whole area is going to remain invisible from the gaze of the city. And this is the condition where we have a public street forming the edge of an informal settlement. These two conditions are particularly important. One of them we call it public overview, and the other one we call it private overview. Private overview is the condition which offers exclusive overview of informal settlements from these. And these high-rise residential or business towers offer these kind of emerging condition of visibility, a private overview, where an exclusive view has become available over these morphologies, the condition that it didn't have before. So what is interesting, the irony here is that formal production of urban developments and process of urban transformation produces a byproduct of private overview, a condition that didn't used to be that before, producing a condition that is often unintentional, but producing a new regime of visibility, which is not public, not accessible to the public, only to the ones that have access to these high-rise developments. That's why it's a private overview. The ones that are privileged enough to have access to these are going to have this particular overview. Why that matters? In many cases, a byproduct of those urban developments have justified the necessity for dealing with these, because now they've become visible, and particularly to the gaze of the ones who don't like to see these next to those. And that particular regime of visibility matters. This condition, which we call it public overview, is again an emerging visibility, an emerging regime of visibility, which has come to the fore. This is the popular practice in the context of the South America, because in many cases informal settlements are located along the escarpments of the cities, which are not easily accessible. So putting metro cable systems is a common practice in many cases, ranging from Caracas in Venezuela to Rio in Brazil, and also Medellin in Colombia, which was one of the earliest ones. This condition produces this new regime of visibility, where the public, including the middle class, the state gaze, and more importantly, the gaze of the international tourists, coming to this condition, the new form of visibility, these settlements have become visible to the gaze of the formal city and beyond international tourism. Why visibility matters? This is Bangkok in Thailand. An informal settlement, a linear one, has emerged along the canal and also under an elevated highway. Again, an irony here is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, informal settlements in this case is more of interstitial conditions where they fill the gaps or cracks of urban development. The formal production of urban development here has produced the kind of vacuum condition as well. But this is not the story of emergence. This area is facing a part of the public space. This is the sidewalk, and there is a formal street just right next to it. And this is a street with considerable amount of traffic going on. The gaze of the middle class passing by and seeing this. What is interesting is here. It is not the informal settlement that matters. It's the visibility that matters. As long as it's going to remain invisible, although it might be just at the street scale, that's fine. So instead of intervening and transforming the condition and attempt to addressing the actual issue, making it invisible. So this becomes then a piece of urban intervention, landscape strategy, to make the tactics of the citizens invisible. Because the visibility to the gaze of the middle class often produces that expectation of seeing a city not out of order, and this considers to be an out of order image. Another approaches towards visibility, which is going to be the last ones, are these two. One of them concealing visibility and the other one revealing and making use of visibility, if you like. This is a part of the main public space in Caracas, and the whole informal settlement is located behind. And this is what has been put in place, along with a propaganda that I think is loosely can be translated as "there's no revolution without young patriots." A form of distraction from the broader story, a new reality, an image that has been produced to conceal what is behind. And I like how these two came trying to push themselves up a bit, although unintentionally, of course. The other condition is not to concealing, and this is a more nuanced approach, actually, because that one is a more direct approach to addressing visibility. This one is a more nuanced visibility, which related to that public overview. A new piece and a new part of the city has suddenly become visible to the gaze of the middle class, to the gaze of the formal city. Those roofs that used to be invisible are now visible. And now visibility has changed the morphologies of urban informality to blank canvases. Whether for informal practice of painting, in quest for place identity and recognition and making use of that new regime of visibility, or to be used by famous international artists to raise their profile, a new real canvas has started to emerge to feed to that stream as well. So in order to understand that one, we can map these conditions of visibility in different cities. This is Pune in India, this is Medellin in Colombia, and this is Bangkok in Thailand. And we are dealing with different conditions of visibility. The insertion of metro cable in Medellin, for example, has produced this orange condition, which is an intensive corridor of public visibility emerging in that settlement. And what is important here is that why that matters, because, for example, in the case of Bangkok, as we've seen, that condition has been treated that way. Visibility, in many cases, along the street, so micro-scale interventions at the street level to conceal informal settlements. In the case of Medellin, roofs have become the new places and the new opportunities for making more incomes. And you can see selling your roof to new advertisement because of that regime of visibility that has been introduced. And in the case of Pune, we are dealing with the condition of no public visibility, no public overview, and the only visible part is private overview from one high-rise development in the center, and most areas to the edges are just offering a facade from the whole area. So in many cases, the gaze of the middle class just passes along the edges of the whole settlement, of the whole district. And those facades have become, or have formed a new cross of formality. Those facades have become, in a sense, formalized to provide, because that's the only part that remains visible. And what is interesting here is that advertisement, the banner that has been put in place there, that interestingly and ironically advertises the new luxury apartment development just along the public facade of that settlement, because this is the only part that is visible. Nobody knows what's behind, especially if you're an external. And the internal ones, the settlements, these settlements are often not that much penetrable, even for the gaze of for the middle class. So you may live in a city and never go to these areas, even if you're local in that city. Okay, so I'm going to finish off with that one.
Thank you, Hesam. It was an amazing presentation, showing us the potential of how an urban morphological study, what kind of question it can pose, and go beyond this limited understanding of formal and informal urban informality, and just open up such a diverse readings of urban informality here as well, researchers. So I would like to share this time with them, but maybe just a few comments on your wonderful presentation. And okay, one major message that comes from you, that we need to go beyond this binary thinking, formal and informal, or equating informality with illegality, informality with squatters only, and even try to come up with a kind of scale or matrix or multiple readings of informality and what it means. And I totally thinking along that line as well. And one question that I'm thinking, okay, we know, okay, there's no such a binary distinction between formal and informal. It's much more complex. Are we all agree on that? Yes, no. Maybe not. But okay, if not, that's good. But I have this feeling that that is already kind of, now we know based on experience, based on accumulation of research, policy failures, and kind of a long, extensive or growing literature as well. But still, yeah, I mean, still the policy alternatives are very much demolish and redeveloped, or this binary understanding as a policy option is still there. So let's think about that. Here in Istanbul as well, is there. This is the only policy that we have. Even though, even in as early as 60s, we had such an holistic understanding of informality with the first Gecekondu law, 775, which is quite a progressive law, trying to see the multiple meanings of Gecekondu in Turkish context, and try to come up with alternatives, not only to kind of demolish, but if it can be upgraded, upgrade. If it can be relocated, relocate. If it has to be demolished, come up with a compensation and then go with the demolition alternative. That was in 1966, no? That early. But still basic. We add another 60 years on that almost. Still the kind of the same policy mentality is working. So one question would be, okay, this might be related to your last part of your question about the visibility, but I believe there is also some other dynamics there. Like the meaning of urban land, the changing meaning of urban land, and what it means, this dichotomic understanding of informality in relation to how capitalism works as well. So I think that's somehow need to be unpacked and discussed. That is one comment that I would like to maybe make, and then would like to hear your point on that as well. But in terms of your last thing about visibility, that reminds me this very famous Tuca Vieira's. You all know this image. So we discussed about this image with Serkan Taycan. He's a photographer who, a friend who took this image from Başakşehir area along the, it's just behind us.
It's not Halkalı, this one?
This is, yeah, it's Halkalı area. This is a Bosphorus Istanbul project, which is a kind of fake Bosphorus, right? 40 kilometers away, building this gated community with a gaze over the urban informality that is being designated as a reserve area. Again, this kind of top-down, very much, let's get rid of policy alternative without understanding how the informality works, how diverse the informality is, how it is adaptive capacity, so all the stories that you were telling. And yes, there's a clear visibility asymmetry there that not only stays there. This story that we discussed that in the book Gecekondu Conversation with Serkan, this kind of the imagery, the meaning of these asymmetrical urban scenes, there is one narrative there. Those buyers of the project, when they kind of look for the future residences, the property developer ensures that the eyesore neighborhood will be cleansed, because the visibility also has this dimension. If it is not, if you want to keep something invisible, what you do is you not only put big walls. Sometimes walls doesn't work. You have to get rid of the neighborhood and then kind of put it back into this kind of economic cycle as well. So they signed this kind of memorandum of understanding, saying that okay, there will be a renewal process and this eyesore will be cleansed, but the neighborhood is still there, and they're kind of, it's an organized neighborhood. That will be my second kind of part of the question. They are resisting toward the reserve area decision, risk area decisions, etc. And at the end, the buyers of these flats sue the company for not really providing the clean visibility. No? So that is the second question I would have on you. Like, okay, you make this kind of urban morphological studies. You have 15 different examples from different cities. Do you see any kind of relation between like right to land, anti-eviction movements with diverse patterns of informality? Could you see any kind of relations with the way in which built environment developed and its effect on social organization of inhabitants and the way in which they become political agents, citizens in the city? So these will be my, I mean, I want to comment another hour, but of course I'll be fair to all of you guys, and yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think they were great observations on the token. I really like that photo. one, I think, comment that I wanted to make, I guess starting from last one to the first one. I think that's a very good point. However, it wasn't the key, scope of our work. I would say, if we want to take it further, that would be a good step and a meaningful also future work that we can also invest on, because that's particularly important. Some of the patterns that we've seen, such as the ones in the middle, I mentioned the process of pirate developments or semi-organized invasions, produce that kind of morphology. For example, having that in mind, that this facilitates the future state interventions, and also put them on the top of the list if they're going to be formalized in future, because they've already tried, I would say, in informal ways to make the access network looking more like the formal city as best as they could. And having in mind that access network is making it problematic if it's going to be self-organized, and if at the same time that II condition where the production of buildings and production of access network are going to be both self-organized, that is going to be producing difficulties. Whereas when we are dealing with spectrum of access network ranging from informal to formal, in a way, if infrastructure is going to be related to the access network, that facilitates the provision of and investing by the state on infrastructure if the access network is going to be already providing that capacity. So there is, I would say, an informal way of anticipatory planning already in place, but that happens in cases where there is a consensus. The invasion is often semi-organized, or there is some developer who is developing the land informally and also selling it to different people who are buying it through informal processes as well. But it's not necessarily the only case. So again, we are dealing with a range of different conditions, and that can be a good point of, a good piece of work to look at the ways in which different spatial configurations are going to be leading to different social networks, and also those resistance from the communities, and also the resistance from the state. Is there going to be a tendency from the side of the state to intervene in specific parts of the city? So what is that criteria that often is used to address some informal settlements? They consider more urgent interventions than the others. Is there a specific relation between the morphological types and those criteria for decision making and intervention and so on? And I think in relation to the question of visibility, that's also a very good point, because in many cases, at some point I mentioned, especially in that private overview condition, which is basically this condition, where this overview is exclusive to the owners or the ones who are living here. So it's not a public overview. This is a form of private overview, and that private overview often views this kind of thinking and the middle class pushing, in a sense, the state to get rid of that condition. And there is also a reverse cycle, that this kind of expectation from the middle class in many cases is a form of unwritten agreement between the state and the middle classes, that they think that the middle class don't expect to see such a view. And they justify demolition based on those expectations. And that makes it interesting as well. So if you put it in a broader context, in a sense, urban developments such as that one is gonna systematically predict future developments as well. So in a sense, it's also a form of a speculation as well. So you're putting in place, you're seeing these kind of trends, because the impacts of visibility is going to systematically justify why that area needs to be demolished, and why, if it should have been demolished later, now it should be demolished sooner, even changing that time frame also when it comes down. Yeah, I think those are the key parts and comments. Is there any other?
I have more, but I will first give to the floor to...
Thank you again for the presentation. Yeah, about this link to the social or public transportation, I think it's one of the key issues of those neighborhoods because they are already economically segregated and also spatially segregated. But we can see that once public transport comes to those areas, they are very quickly gentrified and subject to evictions, things like that. Did you ever try to map if there are existing informal communication patterns between those neighborhoods that are making them alive and surviving without being connected to the city center in a classic, let's say, urban planning pattern where we always see the center and the periphery connected to it, because now in all those geographies, cities are so large that patterns are now from periphery to periphery and things like that. So are there these kinds of patterns that you have been able to map or discuss about?
That's also a very good observation, because one of the themes which is related to the ways in which we need to think about urban informality as a form of multiplicity, and that's why I put also brief parts on informal street trading and informal transport, because these are also related to informal settlements. And there is, for example, there is an intricate relationship between informal settlements and the areas that informal settlements are located in relation to formal modes of transport, formal networks of the city, to informal transport. Because informal modes of transport in many cases works as a filler to fill the gaps of formal modes of transport. And in many cases it offers affordable services to the urban poor. Although I'm not saying that all of the ones who are living in these settlements, because we've got many conditions that it's not necessarily informal settlements accommodating urban poor. It's in the literature, and also it's been discussed before as well. But the thing is that that provides linkages where we are dealing with those informal settlements located at the fringes of the city, or pushed to those fringes because of a range of reasons throughout the process of morphogenesis and transformations. Then informal street trading becomes the key form that connects those to the centers of jobs and opportunities, because that should be in place. That's the first reason that these people are coming to the cities. So having access to jobs and opportunities, if provided by the formal modes of transport, and if that provision is accessible and affordable, then that's going to be the way to access the jobs and opportunities. If not, then there's going to be an emergent informal mode of transport filling that gap and offering that service, if there isn't the case. We've got it in some of the cities, but the other aspect of that, for example, that reminds me of the interventions in particular in Medellin, where a part of the intervention was to connect informal settlements that are socio-spatially, in many cases, segregated from the other parts of the city, was to connect informal settlements to the formal modes of transport. So putting metro cables in one of the areas, which is a Comuna Nororiental, to the, I think, west-north of the city, was that to provide affordable access for those who are located there, and connecting that kind of service to the formal mode of transport in the city. So not only providing access, but also connecting that metro cable to the formal mode of transport. So it's all about connectivity and bringing them to the formal city. So the issue is that the investment on formal modes of transport can only go so far. In many cases, these interventions are just in specific places and cannot be duplicated and provided like state-driven. So in the other cases that we don't deal with that condition, where state intervention is looking for connecting these people more and more to the city and facilitating access to jobs and opportunities, informal modes of transport play that role more efficiently in many cases. such as the example that we've seen that with the motorcycle taxis as well.
This metro cable generated some gentrification in those informal neighborhoods?
We haven't studied that,
Yeah,
but
okay.
it is. I think it is going to be an interesting thing because of already we've got. Yes, we've got someone from the city, actually. So we haven't studied that, but I assume that could be an interesting, inquiry after the aftermath of those interventions as well. Because what they've done in the first place that they brought also both the middle class and also the global gaze of tourists to these areas.
Mm-hmm.
But the impacts of that are yet to be explored.
First of all, thank you for the presentation and such a comprehensive study and boarding or addressing their inquiry for sure. I think that this has brought certain, not gentrification per se, but just kind of new economic development for the communities that are living in these punctual points where the intervention was done. What I was, because it's so interesting also for me, researching in terms of how this public transport system can change the life or the livelihood of the people that actually live there, is that if you go to Medellin, the comunas are huge and it's such a huge urban agglomeration. And what I've understood so far is that for sure there is an enhancement of the living conditions, but most of it is to the people that are living like in the vicinity, in the direct vicinity of this public transport. But the rest of the people still like relies on this informal or other means of transportation, which is so interesting because yes, the publicity that the city brings to the international audience sounds magnificent in the 8 years of the urban east and people throughout the world. But maybe the reality there, it's a good project, but maybe I would say that it has to be complemented with some other in between, in this threshold of the formal and informal again. So and then this study that you conduct of the visibility, wow, interesting. Because just I was reading just this morning about all of this tourism that has been starting to arise in the comunas, mostly international, and for me, well, makes me wonder about this Disneyfication of the urban poor, because maybe this is attracting tourists now, and it's another perspective to see this problem, not to put a wall and ignore it, but bring people to see it, but how or to what extent these kind of actions can hinder also the government of stop the production of these spaces, because now kind of start to be like interesting or something like in the zoo, like let's go, let's see these places because they're so interesting. Let's see how the people actually live, and it's, I don't know, it's interesting, or at least.
Thank you for the presentation. It was great, and this is a very impressive project. So I have two questions. One is, so you map out this variant morphologies, and you map out the complexity. Is there an aspiration behind this project to develop kind of causal explanations of this variation in terms of like kind of identifying possible causal patterns in terms of state intervention, or perhaps other factors that have put these cities into different trajectories? Like, do you have such a aspiration? I'm not sure if it's such so much complexity if that could ever be done, but still, I was wondering. The second question is with regards to something that you kind of point out, like the state strategies and citizen tactics, and you kind of look at the dialectic interactions between these two. But I was wondering, does that distinction to some extent reproduce some sort of a binary as well, in the sense of state interventions in terms of these like failed policy interventions of like demolish and formalize, whereas citizen tactics as informal appropriations of some sort? But I wonder, you know, to some extent the citizens could be implicated in the kind of top-down state demolition and replacement. I think this is a pattern that we observe here in Istanbul. Like it's not so much that citizens are interested in informal employment. They may actually ask for such demolitions and relocations because it could actually generate much more rent than they would, like much more value that can be captured than otherwise. So the citizen tactic could be actually part of that top-down failed policy and like demolish and replace kind of framework. So I was wondering if you observe that in other places that you studied.
Thanks. I think those are also great points. Again, I'm starting from the last one. I think the last one is a good distinction, because that binary distinction is also problematic, and many of these activities happens at the intersections between the two. So the areas, because I'm just going back to that the issue in relation to the expectations of the middle class. It's another form that fuels that kind of demolition as well. So the thing that you're mentioning as well, it's not, we are not, I think it's going to be reductionist if we put the whole society or citizens under one umbrella, that it's going to be a tactic that can be applied by citizens in general, because we are dealing with differences, and in many cases these differences make a difference. And this is the case, that these expectations are going to change the condition, and these tactics are going to be different. And again, we are dealing with a range of different tactics. So again, I think that's going to be problematic if we want to reduce everything and label it as citizens. But for making the point, perhaps we collapse them all to that one. But we are dealing with differences, and throughout, even the issue of visibility, we are dealing again with all of the citizens. This is just a gaze coming from different parts of the society to different parts of the society. And these two, again, are not binary distinctions, because there are also ranges in between. So we are dealing with differences. And I think in relation to the first question, my attempt has been not to jump into conclusions. Because, as I mentioned, I think what's at stake now is to step back, perhaps, for all of us, and I'm sure that the decision makers and the ones who are related to the interventions in these areas. This is not a sentence that they like in many cases, but I think I'm going back to the sentence that I mentioned. I wanted to summarize all of the intervention thinking into one sentence, that poor understanding of how urban informality works is a prescription, is a formula to poor intervention. And I think this is the time we need to step back and settle on the first one. We need to first understand how urban informality works. And this is the key, I would say, the umbrella of all we've done so far. The key question was about how urban informality works before coming to conclusion of how we need to intervene or how we need to approach intervention. Because, first of all, we don't know, or we know very little about how urban informality works, those productive capacities of urban informality, and how we can harness those productive capacities in the process of urban transformation. So not to going with formalization or upgrading or dealing with these areas. So what I'm resisting to get to is to point out causal relationships, because I think we can hardly make those judgments, especially causal relationships, when it comes to urban environments and cities, because the way I see it is more aligned with kind of assemblage thinking, where we are dealing with relations at the same time, process of territorialization, deterritorialization, and reterritorialization, those cycles of change, and also the networks of connections, rather than arrows of causal relationships. I think every process in city is a part of an assemblage, which is in the process of folding from one condition to another. So we are not dealing with causal relationships, we are dealing with networks of connections, more, I would say, rhizomic connections, rather than hierarchic thinking. And I think that's also very important to avoid making those causal relationships, because making those causal relationships is related to what Alexander has pointed out as a tree-like way of thinking in the 60s. That is why it is problematic when it comes to urban interventions. If you're coming from that kind of causal relationship thinking and hierarchic thinking, because urban environments and cities are more of rhizomic networks rather than hierarchies. And when we are trying to impose hierarchies, that's going to make it worse. And in many cases, many byproducts, unintentional consequences, and so on. So what I'm trying to avoid is to avoid making causal relationships. At best, we are trying to unravel parts of those networks of connections to the extent that we can. But I think making causal relationships is not going to be helpful, and especially concerning when it comes to urban interventions, because those are often producing a naive understanding of connections, I think. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Rafael, and we were talking a bit about this, about the perspective, more sociological maybe, because I come from sociology, and I wonder urban about the way that the state, especially in Turkey, with gerrymandering practice, they try to reshape new maps and they create new districts out of all the cities. And do you look at this in a way that disrupting these new districts, making them spatially on the maps, but not having a morphological change? Do you look to these new processes like as informal processes, or maybe I'm kind of confusing my question, but I wanted to say that when you have a new district out of another city, even though you don't have a new settlement, you still have the old settlement, but you have a new formation. But politically, that formation signifies an ethnic group or another political formation that it interferes with the stative practices. Can we look to those formations as informal? How do you look to the concept of visibility and invisibility in that? Is it a bit clear?
I think I'm not sure if I correct me if I'm wrong. Are you asking about those kind of municipality identified boundaries?
Yes.
And how real they are, or can represent the reality of the...
Not in the way that represent the reality, but you don't have a morphological change there, right? But we have a new settlement. I mean, that is spatially configured on the mapping, official mapping. So when you look to that, we have a minority, a political minority that is living there, can be seen that they have informal maybe political practices, but they don't have a morphological practice that changes the structure of the city with all the districts around. They look the same, but they have different practices of spatial practices, but not morphologically, like in real favelas or...
If I understand correctly, I think my take on that would be such boundaries is also again another form of imposing hierarchic thinking. All of these district boundaries is a form of territorialization, which is imposed through hierarchical thinking, because you are imposing a territory which is not necessarily congruent with reality in another way. If you're looking at social networks across the city, those networks often cut across those boundaries. So those boundaries are often there on a map, although it is related to the power of mapping as well. So when you are imposing such boundaries, you're allocating specific resources, and every boundary making practice is a practice of exclusion and inclusion. It's inevitable to draw a line on a map and not exclude or include. So you're always with those lines, excluding some and including others, or vice versa. So that's problematic because those maps then become translated to reality. So you're imposing them, I would say, not even translating them on reality. And the social networks go beyond that. And one other thing is that cities work at different scales and across scales, while those boundaries are often, in many cases, at the same scale. And again, that's problematic, because very small practices at the micro scale can be related to how cities work at the larger scale. And then we miss those lateral connections, if you like, and those overlaps, if we are imposing such boundaries. I'm not sure if that was...
Yes, I just wondering if they can become, because they become visible actually in the map, right?
Yeah.
So they are visible now, settlements, political settlements as well. They can be seen as a different settlement. So yeah, it's related. I mean, it's a bit different than the concept of the presentation, but maybe just, I think this place is a place to maybe fuse new disciplines and try to understand in a different way. So it was very, very helpful for me as well. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Any other comments or question?
Hi. I come from this city, one of the cities that you talked about, which is Pune in India. And first of all, very nice presentation. I was really looking forward to it, and the relationship between public transportation with the informality was really interesting, among others. But about concerning Pune, because I've born and brought up there all my life, so as you might have noticed in your studies, there is no like a very strong public transportation in Pune. So what we have been always doing is, like, fortunately my father had a car, so when we pass through that particular area, we always like, okay, so it's like kind of in between a good area, like a rich area, and then the other side is airport and all the high rise and stuff like that. So when we pass through, it's always like, okay, this is kind of the area where you kind of, ignore the everything, and then you go to a good area where we go for shopping and all that. So and also there is auto rickshaws. And I don't know, like in case of the social and economic mobility of the people living in this area, in my observation, they also are not comfortable with mixing with the other classes. And having just like there is a new metro line proposed and it's coming up. So it would be really interesting to see these classes getting in probably the metros or metro station. I'm not sure. I mean, what was your observation related to this? That the mixing of classes in the transportation law.
Well, we haven't studied that basically, and I think I'm trying not to jump into any again conclusion about that, because I think that requires a specific research, looking at that, because that's going to be interesting, especially if you're mentioning there's going to be a metro line implemented soon. That's going to be providing access, but then the next layer of question is about affordability of the access. So there are conditions that we have formal modes of transport accessible, physically and spatially accessible, but they are not affordable. So then there is another layer of affordability on top of spatial accessibility, being located in the catchment area of each transport station is not necessarily enough, although it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Access to that transport also requires affordability. And then that's the next layer of question. And if those are going to be addressed, it's going to be accessible, it's going to be affordable, then there is another question of, you know, the type of use and the use of that access to getting to the city and looking at those mixed conditions. So we haven't particularly looked at those conditions, and yeah, why not? Are you interested in exploring that condition?
This is my main research interest.
Okay.
Informality. So,
that's interesting.
And transportation is also. Actually, I was really excited to see the relationship today, because I've been thinking, how do I connect these two? But this is a really good start.
Because one of the other things is that we've got data on formal modes of transport in many cases, but primary data on informal modes of transport is not something that is going to be usually accessible. So you may end up collecting primary data if you want to explore informal modes of transport, even when it comes to catchment areas and things like that.
Mumbai could be a good example of mixing different classes in its local train, because it's very affordable.
Yes, because affordability is going to be a critical condition.
And in other cases like Medellin, do they use public transportation in informal settings?
The cable is
being used.
Yeah, that's the idea with the cable, connected informality. The urban slums, or with the metro, the formal metro system. But it's part of the formal grid of transport of Medellin.
Well, I can ask a closing question, perhaps, if I may. Well, this is a question that both of you can answer, and I would appreciate if you can. Well, I'm very much with you in your critique of the gaze of the formal, perhaps, right? Very similar to perhaps the critique of someone like Michael Scott, who's not interested in the urban question, but also his work on seeing like the state, the idea that one can transform, in this case, the urban land, urbanism, and improve it through formalizing it, as long as one follows legal rules and regulations, as well as the principles of urban planning and architecture and this and that. I'm very much in line with your emphasis also that this fails to a large extent because they miss how urban informality operates. But to play devil's advocate, perhaps, isn't that urban informality too? It's not prone, or is it prone to all sorts of power relations as well, including, like, I don't know, patriarchal power relations, or I don't know, land mafia of all sorts. So the question becomes then, it's great to criticize that formal gaze, but is there any risk of maybe over-romanticizing? This is not a question directed to your approach or your research, but it's more like a general question. Is there a risk of over-romanticizing or over-celebrating, perhaps, urban informality and labeling it perhaps as inherently democratic because it's bottom up, or inherently creative as such? Yeah. Just to play devil's advocate. One can ask that question.
That's one of those burning questions. Yes. I think Yes, there is a risk. There is a risk of over-romanticizing the conditions of poverty, and also the thing that has been, referred to as kind of westernization of poverty as well, which is directly related to practice of slum tourism as well. So in a sense, everything has become, or has the capacity to become, and serving as a commodity, whether to serve, the gaze of the tourists, or serving as a new form of product. But I think one thing that we haven't touched upon specifically was about the distinctions, or the things that Tankis frame as the contradictions of informality, referring to the practice of informality from above and from below. So that kind of informality that is also at play from above, and how we often downgrade the informality from below, or that becomes an issue of attention, an issue of concern, whereas informality from above remains unaddressed, or it has been less explored as well. So it is also problematic if we settle entirely on democratic aspects and entirely bottom-up process of informality, because informality can be also at play. It's at another level as well. And many practices of urban development also, they have degrees of informality in play, but this for informality from above that facilitates those processes to take place as well. Yeah. So
I would add, I think that's a very relevant question regarding the romanticization, but I think the question here is what actually mean those multiple forms and meanings of urban informality, and what we can learn from that. And then in our, how you call the built environment professions, how we kind of synthesize that very real information. And the way I see, or the value that I see in thinking about urban informality, at least one of them is linked to spatial agency. There is a room to maneuver, either as a user, squatter, street level, business person, whatever, as a transport agent as well. There is a room to maneuver, room to shape, room to kind of be part of the decisions regarding the city making. That's one. And that also somehow linked to use value, because the way in which, yes, there is also imbalance in terms of power relations, interests for the future, etc., but people shape their living environment with some sort of use value centric practices, and their social relations. It has to be. I mean, if you're not socially producing these spaces, you have no kind of chance to be in this location, kind of parallel what is facing you. So what we can learn in the so-called formal city through these practices, like in the case of the grant level usage of the formal and the informal, that kind of readings that we can do. Something that Sinan was discussing, Sinan, me, and some others on, also with Ayşegül Cankat on that, like what architecture as a field, as a discipline can learn from urban informality. What are the qualities of informality? Not as a kind of nostalgic, romantic thing, but there are something very real there. Because the planner or the architect or the kind of the formality, whatever how we define it, as you say, there is also informality of the talk, but let's put that aside. I mean, how formal is that, no? Like, how come it gets such a building permits and brings so much nature resources, and so there's all these kind of informality going on at some other level, let's put that aside. But what we can learn from that to improve the quality of living in the cities. And I see, based on experience, there's still a relevant question.
I think we have a major problem with the urban planning tools, looking to the city in 2D. In all your examples, or once we walk in this neighborhood, there is something happening in 3D that you can't see from above, and yeah, it's challenging. But yeah, there is this need for an equilibrium between bottom up and top down, and at least room for negotiation, which is the only key, I guess, and that's maybe the only meaning of democracy.
And I think often, perhaps it's going to be more of a hypothesis than anything, than a conclusion. But I think the ways forward is going to be looking at the intersections between formal and informal, and not necessarily dismissing one or taking another. So I'm not suggesting that we need, perhaps, that over-romanticizing of informality is going to leading to getting rid of everything that is top-down and just celebrating what is bottom-up. Whereas, the other side of the story, that they think everything needs to be imposed from top down. I think the solutions often are going to be found at that intersection. And part of the practices, such as the works that, the recent also works of Aravena and so on as well, they are looking at that intersection in a sense, if you step back and think about the ways of thinking. So at that intersection of to what extent formality can be put in place and to what extent informality can play a role, I'm not saying that's the solution, because there are issues that need to be addressed. But that kind of thinking at that intersection, along the intersections between formal and informal, is what is perhaps required. But as I'm saying, it's more of a hypothesis again than any other kind of conclusion.
Maybe we can conclude here. Thanks for coming. Instead of being outside and enjoying the arrival of spring, finally. We really appreciate that. Thanks a lot, Hesam. Thanks a lot, Yaşar. Finally, before letting you go, I would like to tell you a little bit about our next meeting here. So at the very beginning, I mentioned that this meeting is part of this umbrella, not umbrella, but this umbrella program that we initiated a month ago, MADacademy, and our next meeting will be on the Melek Basin. It's a basin in province of Ordu, in northeastern Black Sea region of Turkey. We produced this magazine with Ordu Çevre Environmental Association that is very active and very successful for the last decade or so in Ordu. This little magazine, which will be distributed by the local newspaper in Ordu next month, hopefully. So this next Thursday, between 6 and 8, we will be with Ordu Çevre, Orçev. We'll be introducing this magazine that is based on our fieldwork that we conducted last summer. Spent 2-3 days in the field, collected testimonials, took some pictures, we also have some video recordings as well. We'll be released those next Thursday too. So that would be also an interesting conversation that we will be having with the people of Ordu and Ordu Environmental Protection Association. So if you're interested in something like this, you're welcome to join us next Thursday between 6 and 8.